So after finishing Hell on a Barbarian, or at least making it to the end of Act 3, your goal is to set up for Travancore farming. You can do this with very cheap items, as long as you build right. First off, you're respeccing out of whatever build you played through the game with. Typically when I'm playing in a group, I would be just max shouts. If you played solo, you might have played leap attack until now. This build really focuses on the mercenary doing the killing for you, which is the easiest approach, especially for hardcore initially in Travancore. So I'm just quickly going to mention what I'm gonna use here. You can check out the mercenary guide I have linked for more details on how to gear up the mercenary early on, but it's a couple safety crafts for PDR initially, some rest boots, going to be a blood craft, 20 attack speed gloves, and whatever decent weapon you can get. And I'm using a Might Mercenary, it's the best one for this purpose. For the Barbarian itself, you're gonna want a Spirit initially, just to get a bit of FCR for casting your Warcry. And the remaining gear is basically covering your resistances, a 3 Topaz Helm for MF, and a Rhyme Shield. Now if you haven't found a base for Rhyme until now, you can purchase a 2-Socket Bone Shield at Drognan in normal difficulty. As for the skill setup, I'm going to get 1 in useful passives, 1 in leap for mobility, max bio, max battle command, and 1 point fight item, and the remaining points should be distributed in battlecry and taunt. I'm not sure exactly how much in taunt you need, but it depends on how good your merg is really. Find item got nerfed a lot. I think it's still worth at least 1 point. If you have enough levels and you're doing okay, you might want more, but it really doesn't scale anywhere near as much as it used to at higher skill levels. So you can start off with 1 point. You will probably have to invest some extra points in natural ris just to get your ris where they need to be. Just remember that with the setup you have +3 skills from battle command, so you might not need as many points as you think. And the goal here is to get as much MF as possible on this character and gold find eventually. So as you get better charms and other pieces that give you more resistances, you start to replace slots with more MF. Ideally you want chance cards as soon as possible. Another easy upgrade would be IK Helm, which gives you similar or more MF than the 3 Topaz Helm, on top of some gold find and +2 to Warcry. Chests. You would want a wealth chest as soon as possible for the massive gold find on top of some MF. Initially, you could use Myth. The +2 to Barbarian is not a huge deal, since you're not using Warcry for damage, but it's still helpful for your passives. But if you're really tight on res, you might have to go with the Smoke rune word. Another obvious upgrade you want as soon as possible is Blade of Alibaba, which you can use as your main hand. Just try to maintain at least 20 cast rate breakpoint, even if you're using this as a main hand. Ideally 37 maybe, it's up to you how you feel if it's comfortable or not. But 20 for sure is very manageable on your ring slots and perhaps your belt with a casted crafter belt. As for the mercenary, some early upgrades you really want is Laying of Hands, Fire Risk, 20 attack speed, massive damage to demons. Black Hades, massive damage to demons, and 4 sockets which you can fill with topazes or attack speed jewels. Crown of Thieves, massive gold find, magic find, lifesteal, fire risk, exactly what you need on the mercenary. As for weapon, there's quite a few choices which I've gone over in the mercenary guide. One often overlooked is the Steel Driver. If you double upgrade this, it'll have like 800 top end damage, and the strength requirement won't be very high because of the -50 requirements. Now let's see how it performs in Travancore. Oh, I forgot the offhand. I'd use another Spirit Sword and shop a +3 Warcry weapon just to get a little bit of a boost to the find item percentage. So the goal here is to not taunt all of the council, because you're gonna be taking too much damage. but just taunt enough that your mercenary can handle the remaining part. In this case, there were just too many Hydras, and early on, when your mercenary setup isn't that strong, you're gonna struggle a bit, especially on an aura roll like that. Conviction rolls you definitely just have to abandon immediately. But very soon, when you've upgraded your mercenary a bit, this is very smooth. This was actually kind of the ideal scenario where like half the council is spawning inside, so you only have to deal with half of it outside. But really, as soon as you get a decent weapon on the mercenary, you're gonna smash this in 30-40 seconds every run. Getting out of Travancore and into tier 1 maps, I would respec into Whirlwind regardless of what my endgame mapping setup is going to be. For hardcore, I think there's a minimum amount of items you need, which I'll go over here. Obviously you need a very good weapon. I think Reaper's Toll is probably my #1 choice as a hardcore player. Apart from the damage and amplify damage and deadly strike, you also have massive life leech as well as ignore target's defense, which means you basically don't need attack rating, as long as you're higher level than the monsters you're trying to hit. Another very good choice would be Hellslayer. Massive damage, and if you're Strength Bucket, you'll get like 300 life worth of stats from it. Other choices could be something like an Unbending Will. Ideally, you need a Colossus Blade here, like 300 to 500 damage doesn't really cut it for maps, I'd say. But Colossus Blade with 6 sockets is not easy to get on day 1. Other choices could be the double upgraded Steel Driver, Obedience Cryptic Axe, or something like an Oath Sword. Here's a Colossus Sword, but Balrog Blade would be the obvious choice since it gets 4 sockets from Lhasa Quest, so you just need to find an Ethereal Balrog Blade. Oath has very good damage, especially with the Heart of Wolverine buff, but it doesn't have any leech, so you have to get leech from other slots, like Mana Leech on the Ring, for example. What you choose depends on what you have available when you want to respec, I guess. If you settle for Polearm and Spear Mastery because you want to use a Reapers, but you don't have a Reaper set, you would probably go with Obedience Cryptic Axe, or something like a Bone Hue, with ideally 4 sockets. If you're going to use a Hellslayer, you're going to respec into General Mastery, and you could use the Steel Driver, the Oath, or some other weapon that fits that Mace or Axe class. As for the remaining slots, I'd say Laying of Hands is mandatory. It's just a massive damage boost as long as you're facing demons. String of Ears, you really need the PDR and the Leech. Chest, I'd really want a Black Hades. You could use Lionheart. It's decent stats and damage, but the downfall of Lionheart is the low defense. For the Helm slot, I really like Crown of Thieves, if you don't have an Ariage yet. For Amulet, you're most likely going to need All-Res of some kind, could be a rare, in this case I have a Saracen's Chance. Rings, in this case I opted for a Nagel Ring, because I can get away with it, and it's pretty hard to squeeze MF onto this setup, if you're not using like a Fort Topaz Black Hades, like I am. The other ring slot, I'm using a Mana Leech ring in this case, which right now I actually don't need, as I socketed a Perfect Skull on the weapon, which gives Mana Leech. But I could change this skull for an ED Jewel instead, with a Mana Leech ring. But if you have a decent Life Leech ring with res and stats, you'd probably go for that and use a Peace Skull on the weapon for Mana Leech. Now if you're not using Reapers, you're going to need attack rating for sure, and the typical choice would be Angelic combo here on these 2 slots. But there's a few other combinations, like Hazardous Boots and Belt, gives you all the attack rating you need, but I think for hardcore, to get into maps, you have to be wearing a String of Ears to get PDR. Another attack rating combo would be Saigon's Helm plus another Saigon's Piece. I'd consider the boots ideal in this case. You get 10% lifesteal from this combo as well, so it's very good. As for the Mercenary, I have a Defiance Mercenary right now. I like Act 5 BO Mercenary as well, since you're not going to put skills into BO. I think he's better, but for the safer approach on hardcore, you'd use the Defiance Mercenary just to get the extra 9 PDR and massive defense boost. But with this setup you can handle tier 1s very comfortably. I'll show you a few. Charging Jungle, Ruin Cistern and Horizons are probably going to be your main choices. The only thing you really have to pay attention to with this setup is whenever you run into a Might or Fanaticism or a pack, you have to pay attention to whether or not you have Amplify Curse on you. In that case, you have to be cautious. Oh, and I forgot to go over the skill points. It's obviously going to be max Whirlwind, 1 point leap for mobility, max Mastery that fits your weapon, 1 point increased speed, maybe a couple points, max Iron Skin for DR and defense, 1 deep wounds to have a bit of open wounds for bosses and whatnot, and however many points you need in natural rest to cover your resistances. Again, I'd probably go for max battle command, but I would get at least 10 points for the +2, and 1 point battle cry for bosses and Dark Wanderer events. As for endgame solo mapping with the Barbarian, one of my 2 top choices would be Whirlwind again. I think it has similar clear speed to Leap Attack, but it's easier to die with Leap Attack, so I prefer Whirlwind. Here's a quick look at an endgame setup I would use. I think I'm sticking to Reaper's Toll for weapon for the most part. In this case it's the 4-socket one with the Runes. Damage is pretty decent. Some other choices would be the Steel Pillar. I think you need a really good roll now to beat Reaper's Toll, but it's definitely possible that it's still better if you get a high enough roll. I think the best in slot choice would be a 4-socket Reaper's Toll with some kind of ED Slam like this one. A couple other choices would be Cranium Basher and upgraded Galv of Pain. As you can see, the damage is very good. The problem with these weapons is the strength requirement for hardcore. You'd probably use minus requirements ED Jolts instead of Runes, just to lower the requirements a bit. For the remaining choices, I like Fortitude for chest. If you want to only run tier 1s, you can definitely use Enigma here instead, for mobility. For the helm, my choice is Halberds Rain with the massive PDR it provides, as well as the +2 passives, the attack rating, the BO, everything's good about this helm. Still Saracen's Chance, because you really need res in this build. War Traps are my boots of choice, just because it's hard to squeeze MF onto this setup. BK Ring for PDR, still String of Ears for PDR. Wisp in the second ring slot for the damage buff from Heart of Wolverine and a bit of MF. And gloves could be Steel Rend, Grave Bomb, or in this case Soul Drainer. In this case I don't have Mana Leech anywhere else, so I need Soul Drainer, but you could have a Mana Leech Corruption on a ring or the glove slot, so you don't need to use Soul Drainer necessarily. Inventory will be Geats and typically max damage, maybe all res charms, life charms, small charms, res, max damage, magic find. Mercenary, using a Defiance Merc with the Templar's Might and the Pride for the double damage aura, as well as the Defiance for 9% PDR and massive defense. And this build will do very well in tier 3s as long as the max life roll is not too high. I think your main 3 choices will be Sewers, Throne and River. Oh, and for the offhand, I've upgraded to Double Grandfather for the +5 Warcries. As for the other top choice as an endgame mapping character on Barbarian is Warcry in my case. I think this build is extremely strong. The main issue with it is you need Enigma basically. I think for softcore you might be able to pull something off with a full Nash set with a teleport from the staff. But for hardcore you really need the Enigma and basically every other slot almost to do maps. That's why I prefer playing budget Whirlwind until I can afford the setup for Warcry. There's quite a few ways to put this character together. First let me go over the skills. Again, you have 1 point useful passives. I would probably get 1 point leap just because you're gonna run out of Enigma teleport charges sometimes. Max Warcry and max the two biggest damage synergies, which are Harlem Battlecry. Max Battle Command for the +3 and the synergy effect. Remaining points into battle orders, and in this case I put 1.5 item. It's got very nerfed, so you might not even bother, but I think it's still useful sometimes. For the setup, I opted to go Wizard Spike in this case. You obviously need to hit 105 cast rate, which completely depends on how many cast rate slammed items you have. I really like Wizard Spike because it gives you the massive resist bonus. You could also use a Suicide Branch if you get like a +1 slam Suicide Branch. But if you use a Wizard Spike, you have the choice of using different sockets in your Storm Shield. Typically you'd use Runes for res. In this case I put Shale Runes to make the next faster block rate breakpoint in combination with Water Walk, which I think is quite nice. Helm, I really like Shaco. I think it's impossible to beat for this build with the MF, the defensive stats. Other choices could be rare crafted helm with +5 to Warcry. I've seen some people use Halberds, but I much prefer Shaco. Gloves, you're gonna use cast rate gloves for sure. Maybe cast rate slam gloves, depending on how much you need. In this case I have mana per kill, which is a useful stat. Another choice could be laying of hands, Drax, since they have massive life after each kill, which is a good stat on this build. You definitely want a 10% cast rate slam. Again, it could be pretty tough to make 105 cast rate with this pair of gloves, but it's possible. Belt. I think you're going to use Rack most of the time. As a hardcore player, you might want to use Verdungos if you can get one with cast rate slam, but it's just going to be very tight to hit the cast rate breakpoint, especially if you want additional cast rate to overcap against minus cast rate corrupted maps. Rings, plus skills, cast rate if you need it, life after each kill, in this case I have a cast rate ring with 3 life after each kill slam, as well as some MF. Amulet, on this setup I'm using a +4 because I have the other stats covered. You could use something like a caster craft with cast rate, or a blood craft with life after each kill, depending on what you have. As for the mercenary, you want a repistol with as many sockets as you can get, so you can get as much attack speed as possible to help the amplify proc as fast as possible, since it's a massive damage boost to your character. On top of that, you want to emphasize damage on your mercenary setup as well. I'm basically only using String of Ears for the defensive stats, but the other slots are dedicated to damage. The debuff from your battle cry as well as the damage buff from your battle command makes your merc deal a lot of damage. This setup can definitely do tier 3s comfortably on hardcore. Your main two choices would be Sewers and Throne of Insanity. Another weapon choice I forgot to go over is Grandfather. Again, this comes with 0 FCR, so it's very hard to fit into this setup. But if you can get hands on your 20 fast cast rate corrupted one, you might be able to make it work with enough FCR slams on the other slots. And another thing I didn't cover so much is the sockets here. In this setup you really want life after each kill to help you sustain, so you don't have to pick up health potions. If you don't have a Bloodcraft Amulet, if you're not using Drax, you're going to use some 3 life after each kill dual sockets in Helm and potentially Shield Slot with a weapon.